Welcome to another episode of the Swamp247 Podcast. I'm your host, Graham Hall, joined by my co-host, Jacob Rudner, and football is back in Gainesville. I know everyone is very excited, as are we, to be back out on the practice field, talking to players about what is going to be a critical third year for Billy Napier in Gainesville. Absolutely. I mean, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that a lot of the discussion is centered around, will this be a prove-it year, a make-or-break year potentially for the Billy Napier era here in Gainesville? And we'll just go right back into what happened 2 weeks ago out in Dallas when Florida went out to SEC Media Days. I think you saw a lot of that doubt kind of play itself out when it came to the media rankings. Florida was picked 12th out of the 16 teams in the newly expanded SEC. And Florida had 4 players on the all-SEC teams, none on the first team, which I don't think that was much of a surprise to anyone out there. I wasn't certainly surprised by it. Montrell Johnson was the lone member of Florida's offense on the second team. You had a pair of specialists on the fourth team, Jason Marshall on there as well once again. But 2 weeks later, I think Billy Napier has continued to say that this is something that they don't really pay much attention to. They understand that they're going to have to go out there and prove it. And Jacob and I were at Florida's football facility yesterday. We're recording this Wednesday afternoon on what is a rainy day here in Gainesville. And you heard a lot of confidence coming from this program yesterday, not paying any attention to the outside narratives, focused on proving each other right rather than proving everyone wrong. I guess we'll just jump right into what were some of your takeaways from yesterday, Jacob, inside the Florida football facility, as you got to listen to 7 individuals from Florida's football program talk about the team goals, the offseason strides, how much that they have prepared for the last 7 months for this opportunity to go out and prove a lot of people wrong with what is going to be a very daunting schedule. Just what stood out to you yesterday?
Well, I would say, first of all, that there is certainly a lot of confidence in Gainesville. There are a lot of people who believe that this is Billy Napier's best team. It's sentiment that I would tend to agree with. I think a lot of people would. And they believe that that group is going to be able to push them forward into another, echelon of play that they haven't really achieved so far since the start of the Billy Napier era. And whether that's because they believe they're more talented or there's a greater sense of cohesion within the locker room, which seems to be the case, there certainly is confidence. And, I would also say, and it's worth note, that part of that could be because there needs to be confidence. And this is kind of a make or break year, if you will, for Billy Napier, who's just 11-14 in 2 years at the helm of the Florida program. And so they believe that they're going to be able to do it because they need to. And so that was certainly a theme. More specifically, as it relates to football, a couple things that stood out to me. I do think that Florida feels as though its special teams is going to be a cleaned up act after a pretty hard to watch year last year. Tons of miscues, not enough players on the field, guys on the field with the same numbers on, out of position players on a punt that led to a block in Jacksonville against Georgia. There was a whole list of problems with Florida's special teams unit. They bring in Joe Houston from New England, and he seemingly has done a very good job to kind of reorganize things. Billy Napier said during Florida's media day that Joe Houston was needed. They viewed the special teams operation as a situation that needed some additional help organizationally in order to be able to get guys into the right spots and set things up in a way that was, a little bit more acceptable. And so Houston has done a good job of that. Florida has expressed confidence that it is getting stronger. I think that was a big theme as it relates to football yesterday. There is a lot of optimism regarding the strength and conditioning staff after Florida made a change in the department. Mark Hockey was in charge of the unit for the first 2 years under Billy Napier, and now they've changed that. Tyler Miles has taken over and is in charge there. So Florida feels really good. We're going to have to wait and see. Obviously, talk is only worth so much, but Florida's fall camp is now underway. And if there was one thing really to take away again, I think it would be just the general sense of confidence that Florida has both at the player level and at the coaching level before they really start to get out onto the field and kind of prove why it is that they're so confident in general.
Yeah, I was talking with some people afterwards and saying that this is probably one of the most positive press conferences that you're going to have all year long because, you're really only competing with yourselves, seeing how much better you can get. You're not suffering a loss. It's been, 7 months before you've suffered defeat on the field here. You don't really have to answer any difficult questions. You can speak to the growth, the talent that you've added. Obviously, you get Graham Mertz back for a second season here in Gainesville, and I thought he exceeded external expectations last year. And you heard Billy Napier out in Dallas say that, he thinks he can have a breakout year, and what that means for a guy who passed for nearly 3,000 yards and missed the final 5 quarters of action last season. I mean, he has a chance to enter the top 10 single season passing record here at Florida. So if he can up his game, make more downfield explosive passes in this offense, even though they have to replace, some weapons there, and Trevor Etienne, Ricky Pearsall, I think that really speaks highly to Florida's competitive chances. Absolutely. But I'm with you. Yeah, this is the time where you should be very confident. It would be kind of, I think, jarring to have a head coach and the players not come out and seem overly confident that they've put in work tirelessly behind the scenes and it's not going to pay off. I think that'd be a pretty concerning message if you weren't getting this message of confidence coming out here. You brought up special teams. I think that certainly is a massive question that we face over on the board at Swamp247. We've asked Billy Napier about it repeatedly. We've talked about Chris Couch. And if they have to go back to some basics, I thought the Matt comment was really interesting, having the special teams Matt on the sideline to ensure that they have everyone, all 11 guys, in position to go and avoid some of those miscommunication issues, the number issues, whatever they were. If they can avoid that, I don't care what it takes. I think that fans will be happy just to see the results pay off here. Something that I do want to ask you about, because it really kind of was intriguing to me, was Joe Houston's sentiment that special teams play over the last 15 years has become more difficult, because that's something I really haven't heard too often. But he really said that the coaching has become a lot better at the special teams level. It's harder to block punts and kicks than it maybe was a decade and a half ago. Long snappers are faster now. I don't think that's really a narrative that too many people have heard. I hate to say that that's necessarily an excuse, a preemptive one for a unit, but maybe it is the reality. Did that kind of surprise you to hear that a little bit? Because I do think that there's this sentiment that special teams is a check the boxes, do this, this, and this, put your players in the right position, and you're going to have a chance to be successful. But he seems to believe it's a little bit more complex than that, having studied the game for the last decade, that this is maybe something that is an evolving art in a way, and you have to kind of be ahead of the curve and do some things a little bit differently if you want to give your chance to make some of those swings, blocking a kick and having a chance to return it, having a chance to return a punt block as well. Maybe those things are a little bit more difficult than I think a lot of people envisioned. Did that kind of surprise you?
No, not really. I mean, I think that the reality is that the game of football in general continues to evolve every single year, and aspects of it become more difficult as it does so, whether that's, throwing the ball down the field and generating explosives, whether that's blocking for your quarterback, running the football, or in this case, special teams. I think it's just a widely accepted sentiment that, the game is getting harder and players are getting more talented. And as those two things continue at the same time, it doesn't get easier. And so, sure, I believe that to be true. I think that the most poignant thing that Joe Houston had to say yesterday, however, was that Florida didn't really have great organization last year. I know I said that a couple minutes ago, but he emphasized that while special teams are getting more difficult, it's not an excuse for the unit to not be perfectly stationed or have 11 guys on the field. And yes, it's true that teams do make mistakes and players and coaches make mistakes, but the reality is that Florida cost itself several times last year with its special teams miscues, and that just can't happen. And so Houston basically said, and to your point about the launching pad, that he has put, checks and balances in place that will try to mitigate some of those factors. And to your other point, yes, it is going to be important for Florida to be able to try and generate some of those swings in this third phase of the game. You mentioned blocking punts. Florida has spent more time on trying to work on punt block than it has in the previous 2 years. I've talked to a couple sources who have informed me that, Florida spends more time on special teams in general throughout the practices that it maybe wasn't doing last year. And it wasn't, an oversight within its practice structure last year. It's just clear that it's dire for this team to improve upon the way that it performed in the category in 2023. So yes, I think that it could be marginally more difficult than it was last year or even the year before that. But Florida is trying to do as much as it can to put itself in a position not only to thrive, but at a minimum to take a massive step forward in that area, because last year was, again, just so poor.
Yeah, and Joe Houston made it clear that he has a ton of confidence in Chris Couch. They have a relationship dating back to a decade when they worked together at a camp, that they have this established familiarity that should really allow them to work in sync pretty well, rather than making a change at special teams coordinator. Florida just kind of brought another cook into the kitchen. So another, when you talk about oversight, another set of eyes that is able to just make sure that everything is being run accordingly. And like you said, the checks and balances are there in place. And, you talk about takeaways and opportunities for this team to have more chances at offensive success. That is one right there in the special teams game. This is a defense that only had 3 interceptions last season, another number that needs to improve this year from a takeaway standpoint. And if you can add some block punts, kicks, get some good returns in the kick return game, punt return game, I think that'll really give you a really good chance. I think that maybe the conversation with Joe Houston got a little bit overshadowed, though, by someone that I think a lot of people wanted to hear from. That's Tyler Miles, who was elevated from his other role when he was, working here in the strength and conditioning program. Craig Fitzgerald leaves there in February to reunite with Bill O'Brien at Boston College. And you saw Florida's players come together and meet with head coach Billy Napier and vouch for Tyler Miles to be the guy in charge. And everything we've heard, granted, going back to what we just said, it is a time of being confident, and they're coming out of a very successful training program in their eyes. But everything we've heard has been very, very positive regarding the plan that he's overseen. He spoke about the over 1,000 pound swing that you've seen with guys losing more than 400 pounds of fat and adding 575 pounds of muscle to their frame, how guys feel like they're stronger. We heard about, hitting PRs in speed. You heard about 2 guys hitting over 23 miles per hour, 15 players hitting 22 miles per hour. And Tyler Miles said that anywhere else that he'd worked previously, he had never had more than 5 guys on a roster hit over 22 miles per hour. What stood out to you about the strength and conditioning standpoint? Are you buying it, or are you kind of taking a cautious approach like I think a lot of people are? I'm going to go ahead and just give my opinion on it, because I do think that a lot of it is positive. And if it can help Florida avoid some injuries, I think that's massive. But, this is my 10th season on the beat, and we've heard time and time again positive impressions coming out from the strength and conditioning program. The guys every single year in June and July are saying that they're getting stronger and that they're in the best shape of their lives. And then the season rolls around and that doesn't really come to fruition. Ultimately, you can see the narrative shift pretty quickly when it comes to the strength and conditioning coordinator. They can end up being scapegoated in less than a year's time, where people say, actually, that wasn't the guy. That really is I'm kind of taking a wait and see approach just based off previous history. I would love to be wrong here and be able to, see kind of the opposite in a sense here, but I kind of in the camp that I got to wait and see that the missed tackles are cut down, that Florida's able to win and shed blocks at a higher rate, win their one-on-one matchups. Are you in that camp with me, or do you really feel like there's been some noticeable improvement that you're going to see on the field this season from the strength and conditioning program?
Well, I think 2 things can be true. One, I think that for the most part, and just generally speaking, like you said, there is a degree to which the impact of strength and conditioning can be overblown, throughout an offseason. Players, like you said, are in the best shape of their lives. They're very confident that's going to translate to improved play and the best play of their lives. And more often than not, we see that isn't really the case. And I think that is a reality that is worth addressing. At the same time, though, I do think it's true that Florida has taken a step in the right direction, perhaps even a massive step in the right direction in its strength and conditioning department. So yes, while I'm waiting to see exactly what that looks like on the field, I am ready to say at this point that the changes that were made to that area were not only necessary, but have paid off so far. Florida's players are as fast as they've been, whether that's in, contact or, sprinting in a straight line with a vest that tracks your speed. It doesn't really matter to me. Florida is as fast as it's been in the Billy Napier era. Florida's players are doing more in the weight room than they ever have. They are benching more. They're squatting more. Tyler Miles told us that the squat is kind of a measurement for this staff, and they are having guys squat more weight on average than they had in the previous 2 years. These are tangible results that indicate a step in the right direction with the training program. Another thing that I think is really important is Florida's health right now. We only saw 1 player on the opening day of fall practices in a non-contact jersey, and that was freshman safety Gregory Smith. Everybody else was either in attendance were healthy and expected to be in attendance throughout the rest of the week. And Florida wasn't that way the last couple of years. We saw far more injuries coming out of camp for this Gator team that just aren't there now. So whether it's Tyler Miles in the strength department, whether it's Jake Sankall, who's also gotten some rave reviews in the nutrition department for how he's overhauled that. Billy Napier has been effusive in his praise of both of those staff members. And I think I do see the results. What that will translate to is, of course, still a question. We don't know, is that going to lead to a more effective pass rush? Is Florida's offensive line going to hold tougher and be more stable than it was last year when it was very porous? These aren't questions that we can answer right now. And granted, it's great that Florida has stronger players in general, but like you said, that doesn't account for football technique, and it doesn't always translate. What we can say right now, though, is that relative to what this program looked like at this time last year, I think it's pretty safe to say that the strength and conditioning department is in a better position than it was.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Jake Sankall, because that's another element that I think that maybe flies a little bit under the radar. He's not just the director of nutrition, but he's someone who is actively involved in all of Florida's workout program. He really is the assistant strength and conditioning coordinator as well. So it's kind of like a similar setup to special teams, where you have another cook in the kitchen there who's able to, I thought it was really interesting when he was talking about assigning these individual weight goals. If you need to be at 300 pounds on Monday, you have to be at 300 pounds on Monday. And a lot of that is run through Billy Napier, what he wants guys to be at. So it's a very collaborative process. I thought that was certainly something that stood out to me in yesterday's session as well. But yeah, I think that, we were out there today. I noted that it was raining. Florida practiced this morning. We got to watch a great 10 minutes of individual drills out there at Florida's outdoor practice facility. And I do think that the lack of black non-contact jerseys was something that stood out. And there were certainly some guys in spring who were still working their way back that I did think were question marks heading into this camp. Guys like Austin Barber, Justice Boone, we knew Shamar James was progressing well. Andy Jean is certainly one. When you go to the Swamp247 message board, a lot of speculation about how healthy he will be for this year. He looks like he's someone who has lost weight and gotten better shape as well. And if he can avoid injuries, he has a chance to contribute in a wide receiver room that added a lot of talent. Added Elijah Badger, Tank Hawkins, TJ Abrams, and he is someone who certainly needs to prove that he can carve out a role for himself this season after he was extremely limited throughout spring. So that was probably my biggest takeaway from being out there at practice earlier today here as well. I do think that this is a program that, is very confident. We'll have to see. You had a good take on the strength and conditioning program. The numbers don't lie. Absolutely. The gains that Florida has made, the fact that they've lost is certainly something I'm not going to argue with. Will it pay off this upcoming season, knowing that Florida is going to play a daunting slate of Power 5 opponents, 11 Power 5 opponents, and they got to take on Samford as well here, a team that, as a lot of Florida fans know, scored the most first-half points in any opponent in Florida program history not too long ago. So it absolutely is something that we're going to be monitoring throughout the year. Last thing before we get out of here, position battles. That was a huge topic of conversation when we talked to Jake Slaughter on Tuesday as well. He said he expects there to be competition at the offensive line room. You certainly look at linebacker as well. Ron Roberts mentioned that, he wasn't willing to say that Grayson Howard was going to start with Shamar James. He said it starts with Shamar, and then there's Pup Howard, and then there's Aaron Childs, who we wrote about over at Swamp247. He said RJ Moten has looked really, really good for the past 6 months after moving over from safety. Linebacker is certainly another spot with competition. I mentioned Justice Boone, the competition there at the F position, having guys like LJ McCray as well. Are you, I think, encouraged by the amount of competition that is going to be that is going to be going on here in Gainesville? There's a statement that, if you have two quarterbacks, you don't really have one, but I don't really think that rings true when it comes to the other positions, because you need to have depth across the board. Does the statement that they're going to have competition battles over the next 3 weeks here in Gainesville, how encouraging is that to you? And how much do you think that speaks to Billy Napier's statement that the depth along this roster is the best it's been since he arrived here in Gainesville?
I kind of see it as a double-edged sword, Graham. On one hand, I think that the competition is a healthy thing, and it is a sign that the roster is deeper. There are better players, up and down the lineup, if you will. And Florida now has to figure out exactly who is the best suited to step into a starting role. That's a good thing. You want to have that kind of competition. But there are certainly areas that I look at where competition is occurring, and it makes me scratch my head. And that's just, the reality of the situation. I think along the offensive line, there are concerns that the right side is not really coming together the way that Florida had hoped it would. Damian George was projected to be the starting right guard, at the start of spring practices. Now that seems like it could be a little bit up in the air. Cameron Waits is a guy who's battling to maybe get some starter reps or some high usage reps off the bench at right guard. And Cameron Waits is practicing at right tackle. I've heard from sources that Waits has kind of split his time between guard and tackle with the first team unit. Brandon Crenshaw Dixon, the tackle transfer from San Diego State University, is another guy who was a projected starter when Florida acquired him via the transfer portal, and is now in this situation where he's in a rep share for first team reps. And is that a credit to Cameron Waits? Perhaps, but Waits hasn't really done much in his time at Florida. Injuries have really slowed him down. It was first the torn Achilles, and then over the course of the spring, when a lot of these competitions started to bud a little bit, he didn't practice at all because he had a significant calf strain that held him out until the summer. So the fact that Waits is starting to push guys like Damian George or Brandon Crenshaw Dixon, who you got out of the transfer portal, I don't know if that's a sign of the program being in a really good spot health-wise, or there being some very reasonable concerns that the guys who Florida brought in to be starters, be it Damian George or Brandon Crenshaw Dixon, aren't doing enough to really lock down those roles. Austin Barber has locked down a role, and he was injured last year, wasn't necessarily getting on the field as healthy as he wanted to be at any point, really, or at least that's what we've been told. And he is in a position now to start. Najee Harris is a true sophomore, who played the majority of his reps on special teams last year, and he seemingly has locked down that left guard position at this point. Jake Slaughter, another guy who has a varied level of experience between starting and coming off the bench, and he too seems to be well poised to be a starter. There isn't competition there, despite Florida having depth that I think is worth having some confidence in. Bryce Lovett is a guy who we've heard a lot of good things about. Caden Jones is a guy who we've heard a lot of good things about. We're not really hearing Devin Manuel's name, the Arkansas transfer who could be playing tackle for the Gators. It seems like he is kind of further down on the depth chart along the offensive line. These are the kinds of things to me that it just kind of depends on how you look at it. Sure, on one hand, Florida could be in a really good position because it has guys in the fold now who are battling, and Cameron Waits could be in a position where, a really good tackle like Brandon Crenshaw Dixon is still being pushed by a guy like Cameron Waits, who's now in his fourth year of college. That is a possibility, to be clear. My concern, however, is that it is not necessarily a byproduct of guys being at this super high level and competing, but rather guys who were expected to step up not doing so. On a more encouraging note, I think that Florida has a lot of depth at wide receiver that I look at and I go, this is a good thing. Elijah Badger could be a starter, might not be a starter based on what you and I have been told throughout the preseason. He's going to need to prove himself throughout camp to really lock down a spot in the top three. Khalil Jackson is a guy who's pushing for a spot in the top three. It sounds like Chimere Dike and Eugene Wilson are already locked in. Marcus Burke is another guy who we've heard good things about and could compete for a significant level of reps. That, to me, is a lot more healthy than what we're hearing about the offensive line, which comes across a lot more like uncertainty to me. So I think we'll see. I think that camp will tell whether or not this is a matter of Florida being deeper and better across the board, or positions not necessarily being figured out yet because guys haven't stepped up to the plate. And there's a very significant difference between those two. And it's a good question and one that we'll have to continue to monitor.
Yeah, absolutely. Good answer. I do think there's two different types of competition. There's one where you don't really know what you have and one where you're looking to push some other guys on your roster. I do think that the depth that Florida has along the offensive line from the younger guys, you mentioned Jones, Zandamela has, continually impressed, but very, very young, a first-year guy who is transforming his body. He's added more than 20 pounds to his frame since arriving at Florida back in May. I mean, that is a guy who absolutely is someone that in a couple of years could be an impact starter for Florida. Bryce Lovett as well. But those guys aren't really, from what we've heard, in contention to play a starting role this year. And so the guys who are in contention to play a starting role, if they really are still in this little bit of a battle here right now where Florida has some uncertainty or players aren't meeting expectations, I think that could be certainly an issue for the Gators here. And this is an offensive line that really needed to improve from last season, not just creating holes for the backs to run through, but when it came to protecting the quarterback. Graham Mertz, I know he wasn't injured on a sack last year, but he took more than 30 sacks, took a bunch of hits last year. I think he really proved that he was more durable than people expected him to be, but they're going to need to protect the quarterback at a higher rate this season and give him more time in the pocket to make those downfield explosive passes that I was talking about earlier. If they don't do that, this offense is not going to take the step forward with the skill pieces that they have on the roster. And that would be quite unfortunate, especially for Florida's competitive chances, because you do think that this offense has an opportunity with Mertz returning, Eugene Wilson, adding Elijah Badger, who I do think, like you said, will have a really good chance at starting early on this season for the Gators. But I do think that there is a belief from coaches that you don't just hand a starting position to a player based on their productivity elsewhere just because they arrive at your program over guys like Khalil Jackson, who have been working here, working their way up from being a former walk-on to earning a starting spot there in spring. I do think they're going to have to go out there and win that job. So that type of competition, if Florida can't take advantage of the talent and the production returning that they have on their roster, it's really going to be quite unfortunate for a team that has a very small margin of error this season. So absolutely, the offensive line is one we're going to continue to monitor. Obviously, the interior of the defensive line is a position as well that I'm really intrigued by with Joey Slackman coming in. What will Desmond Watson's role this year be this year? Jamari Lyons is a guy that they're looking to have take a step forward. Cam Jackson, I think, still has a little bit of physical improvement that he can do before this season. I do think he will make that over the next month, but where will he be at when the season opens? Caleb Banks looks good as well. Brian Taylor Jr. is an impact addition potentially for this team from a player that you maybe didn't expect to play a large role this year. So certainly a lot of intriguing competitive battles, but some other ones that you maybe scratch your head at right now and say, okay, this could be a little bit of a concern. So with all that said, just the first day of camp in the books. So we'll have a ton more information coming to you over at Swamp247 for the next month before Florida opens the season a month from today against the Miami Hurricanes here in Gainesville. It's absolutely going to be a can't-miss affair at 3:30 p.m. Going to be very, very intriguing in many ways. Two coaches that I think are in very similar positions. Mario Cristobal, not much of a better record than Billy Napier, and you could argue in a little bit of a weaker conference, but maybe the consensus right now is that he has that program on a little bit more of an upward trajectory right now than Billy Napier's. That narrative could certainly change when the game is said and done after 60 minutes of football here in the Swamp. So, like I said, ton of content coming to you over at Swamp247. We'll be back very, very soon with another episode of the Swamp247 podcast. And before we get out of here, I got to let you know that if you're not a VIP subscriber, this week you can take advantage of our 60% off an annual subscription deal, one of the best deals you can get all year long. Join the message board. Join the community over there. Very passionate group of Florida fans. Reach out to us over there as well. We'd love to have you. And for now, that's going to do it for this episode of the Swamp247 podcast. For Jacob Rudner, I'm Graham Hall. We'll see you next time.